In the wind-worn valleys of the Old West, where a man's worth was measured by the speed of his draw, and legends rose from blood-stained dust, whispers told of a gunslinger unlike any other, not the celebrated marshals from penny dreadfuls, nor the infamous outlaws with bounties on their heads, but a ghost who drifted through frontier settlements with weathered hands and eyes that revealed nothing. They called him the Phantom Hand, though few knew his true name, and fewer still lived to speak of his lightning-fast draw. This is the tale of Emmett Reeves, whose gentle demeanor masked a deadly skill, and whose reluctant gun had dispatched more than 30 men to early graves. Join me today as we uncover the story of the man they named the Phantom Hand, who proved that the most dangerous predator is often the one nobody sees coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cimarron Creek, New Mexico Territory, 1878. The relentless summer heat bore down on Cimarron Creek, baking the town's weathered boardwalks and forcing most sensible folk indoors during the punishing midday hours. Dust devils danced across the main street, stirring up miniature storms that vanished as quickly as they formed. The setting sun painted the distant mesas in hues of amber and crimson, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the parched earth. It was on such an evening that Victor Crane and his band of hired guns first laid eyes on the quiet blacksmith who would eventually seal their fates. The Iron Horse Saloon had become the unofficial headquarters of Cimarron Creek's rapidly expanding cattle empire, not for its watered-down whiskey or its crooked card games, but because Victor Crane had declared it so. And in this dusty corner of the territory, what Victor Crane wanted, Victor Crane got, through persuasion if possible, through violence. When necessary, whispers had been spreading about the mysterious new blacksmith whose gentle touch with horses had transformed the town's livery into a place of remarkable reputation. Some claimed he had a gift for calming even the wildest mustangs, while others swore they'd seen him reshape metal with the kind of intuitive knowledge that suggested the material spoke directly to his soul. Within weeks, ranchers were bringing their finest stock from miles around, trusting them only to his care. Emmett Reeves worked in silence, his movements carrying the fluid efficiency of a man who'd learned that needless words often caused needless trouble. His worn leather apron bore the marks of his craft, small burns, metal filings, and the honest sweat of a man who shaped the world with his hands rather than his voice. The livery owner, Thomas Holloway, had given him the job with no questions asked, impressed not only by his skill with horses and iron, but by the steady stream of customers his reputation had attracted. Those who observed Emmett at work noticed 3 distinct things: the uncommon patience with which he approached each task, the way his eyes constantly assessed his surroundings as if calculating invisible geometries, and the curious fact that his right hand always remained clean, wiped methodically after each task, while his left bore the grime and calluses of his trade. What none of them recognized was that the same clean right hand had drawn a gun in more than 30 showdowns across the Western Territories, earning him whispered names like Death's Quiet Servant before he vanished from the gunfighting circuits. Now he shaped horseshoes instead of widows, though the custom Remington that had served him so faithfully lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the floorboards of his modest room, a reluctant companion in a land where death arrived without invitation. That revolver's blue-black finish bore no ornamental engravings, no silver inlays or fancy pearl grips, just honest wear from years of use and the kind of perfect balance that came from a weapon becoming an extension of its owner's will. When drawn, it became less a tool and more a natural phenomenon, like lightning deciding where to strike. Victor Crane was everything Emmett was not, loud, flamboyant, and viciously proud of his reputation as Cimarron Creek's most feared power. A broker. His father's fortune from eastern railroads had bought him land and influence in territorial circles, but money couldn't purchase the honor he fundamentally lacked. He and his collection of equally privileged henchmen had made sport of terrorizing the area's merchants and laborers, demanding protection payments with the casual cruelty of men who had never faced true consequences. The first time Crane entered the livery, Emmett was working with a magnificent Palomino stallion, his hands moving with practiced care as he checked the animal's injured foreleg. The blacksmith's fingers probed gently, communicating through touch rather than sound, diagnosing the problem through a conversation only he and the horse understood. Crane swaggered through the stable doors, his silver-plated spurs jangling against the wooden floor, making crude remarks about the livery's condition, while his three companions laughed with forced enthusiasm. The sudden noise caused several horses to stamp nervously in their stalls. "Well now," he drawled, stopping before Emmett's workspace, "what have we here? Another drifter making himself at home in my town?" His shadow fell across the stallion like an oil slick on clean water. Emmett continued his examination, his movements unhurried. Those who knew him in his previous life would have recognized the dangerous calm in his posture, the same stillness that preceded lightning-quick draws in the dusty streets of a dozen frontier towns. "I'm talking to you, Smithy," Crane snapped, his hand unconsciously settling on his ornate revolver. "It's proper manners to acknowledge the man who owns half this territory." The stable fell quiet, the only sound the nervous shuffling of horses sensing the tension crackling in the air. Emmett turned slowly, his grey eyes meeting Crane's with a steady gaze that made the rancher momentarily reconsider his approach. When the blacksmith finally spoke, his voice was soft yet distinct, like distant thunder that made you count the seconds until the storm arrived. "Horses don't much care who owns what, Mr. Crane. They only know kindness from cruelty." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, somehow feeling more like a warning than the observation it appeared to be. The silence that followed seemed to crystallize around them, delicate and dangerous as frost on a window pane. Crane's face flushed red, unused to such a directive, quiet challenge. His companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in atmosphere without fully understanding it. Thomas Holloway, watching from the stable's entrance, felt his heart climb into his throat. He'd invested too much in his new blacksmith to lose him to Crane's notorious temper. "He's the best horse handler I've ever seen, Mr. Crane," Holloway explained hastily, stepping forward. "Half the ranchers in 3 counties are bringing their stock here now. Good for the whole town's business." "Perhaps," Crane said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you don't understand how things work in Cimarron Creek." He leaned closer, his expensive cologne unable to mask the whiskey on his breath. "Every business here pays for protection. Every single one." His finger tapped the butt of his revolver meaningfully. Emmett's hands never trembled as he returned to tending the stallion's leg. His movements remained precise and measured, even as tension thickened the air around him. "I've seen protection in my time," he said softly, eyes on his work rather than Crane. "True protection comes from building something of value, not threatening to destroy it." The Palomino, sensing the tension, stamped nervously. Emmett's hand moved with incredible speed to calm the animal, and something in that fluid motion made Crane's companions take an instinctive step backward. For a brief moment, the careful facade of the quiet blacksmith flickered, and beneath it lurked something that had made hardened gunfighters tremble in their boots. Maria Sandoval, watching from her father's general store across the street, couldn't suppress a small smile. She had heard rumors about the new blacksmith's peculiar confidence, the way he seemed unaffected by the threats and schemes that usually plagued newcomers in frontier towns. Some attributed it to naivety, others to foolishness, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. But there was something in the Smith's posture that reminded her of her late father, a Texas Ranger who died with his boots on and his gun smoking. Crane's revolver appeared with sudden violence, not drawn but used as a pointing stick, gesturing at Emmett's chest. The gunmetal gleamed dully in the late afternoon light streaming through the stable doors. Accidents happen so easily in this territory, he sneered, especially to those who don't appreciate proper business arrangements. Emmett set his tools down with deliberate care, his movements precise as a clockmaker's. He turned to face Crane fully, and something in his gaze made even the rancher's companions take another step backward. For a moment, even the horses went still, as if they too sensed the deadly current running beneath the surface of this seemingly simple confrontation. When the blacksmith spoke again, his voice remained soft, but carried with it a clarity that cut through the stable air like a well-honed blade. "I've seen proper business arrangements, Mr. Crane, seen them conducted with honesty in California, with fairness in Arizona, and with respect in Colorado." His gaze never wavered. "What you offer is nothing but common thievery dressed in expensive leather." Thomas Holloway moved to intervene, but Maria Sandoval, who had entered the stable to witness the confrontation, raised a hand to stop him. The young woman had seen enough frontier justice to recognize when deeper currents were moving beneath the surface. There was something about Emmett's stance that spoke of complete confidence. Not the false bravado of youth, but the absolute certainty of someone who had measured their opponent and found them wanting. Crane's hired guns had grown unnaturally quiet, watching their employer with nervous anticipation. They'd seen him have men beaten for lesser insults, seen businesses burned and lives ruined for the mere suggestion of defiance. But something about this situation felt different, as if the usual script had been quietly replaced when no one was looking. "You have 1 week," Crane snarled, trying to reassert control of the situation. "1 week to reconsider your position. After that—" He let the threat hang in the air, tapping his revolver meaningfully. Emmett's eyes never left Crane's, and in their grey depths lurked something that made even the hardened rancher uncomfortable. Not fear or anger, but the kind of deadly patience that reminded old-timers of a wolf watching from the tree line, calculating the precise moment to strike. 7 days, Emmett said simply, his voice barely above a whisper, as Crane and his men stormed out of the stable, their spurs jingling discordantly against the wooden floors. Maria Sandoval finally released the breath she'd been holding. "My friend," she said, approaching Emmett with careful steps, "I do believe you've just made a rather dangerous enemy." Emmett's hands returned to their work, checking the Palomino's leg with the same careful precision he'd shown before the interruption. "Not an enemy," he said softly. "Just another man who needs to learn that strength and power aren't the same thing." Thomas Holloway began straightening the tools Crane's dramatic exit had scattered, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Reeves, if you wish to leave town, I would understand completely. Crane has influence, connections. His father—" Emmett's sharp glance cut through Holloway's words like a hot knife through butter. "His father's money cannot buy him skill," he said quietly, "nor can it teach him honor." In the growing twilight, Emmett continued his work, but those watching closely might have noticed how his right hand stayed cleaner than circumstances would normally allow, how his eyes tracked every shadow that moved across the stable doors, how he positioned himself to always face the entrance rather than turn his back to it. 7 days, he had acknowledged. 7 days before Cimarron Creek discovered why whispered legends of the Phantom Hand still circulated around campfires throughout the Western Territories. Word of the confrontation at the Iron Horse spread through Cimarron Creek's dusty streets like wildfire. By nightfall, every saloon and gambling hall buzzed with whispers about the new blacksmith who had dared to defy Victor Crane. Some praised his courage, others condemned his foolishness, but all waited with bated breath to see how the drama would unfold. At his private quarters above the Silver Spur Saloon, Crane nursed his wounded pride with expensive Kentucky bourbon. His closest lieutenant, Franklin Pierce, watched with growing concern as his employer's mood darkened with each glass. "Perhaps," Pierce suggested carefully, cleaning his wire-rimmed spectacles, "we should look into this man's background before proceeding further. Something about him seems familiar." Crane's laugh held no humor. "A blacksmith with dirty hands and a soft voice. What's to know?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the lamplight. "Though I must admit there was something about his bearing, like a card player holding aces and waiting for the right moment to show his hand." In the shadows of the saloon's reading room, an elderly man named Ezekiel Doc Thompson lowered his newspaper, his interest piqued. He had spent decades as a field surgeon for various railroad companies, patching up the aftermath of countless gun battles. Something about the description of the quiet blacksmith tugged at old memories. Stories whispered around campfires about a gunfighter who never raised his voice, who appeared like a spirit of vengeance when needed, then vanished like morning mist. Doc Thompson's weathered fingers traced a scar on his left wrist, a reminder of a Comanche arrow he'd removed from himself 15 years ago. He'd seen every type of man the frontier could produce, but the truly dangerous ones he knew were rarely those who announced their threats the loudest. Back at his modest room above the livery stable, Emmett Reeves was entertaining an unexpected visitor. Maria Sandoval had returned, bringing a small basket of fresh tortillas and spiced beef from her father's kitchen. The lantern light cast her shadow against the rough-hewn walls, elongating it like the evening sun had done to the town's buildings hours earlier. "You must forgive my intrusion," she said, setting out the meal on his simple wooden table. "But I felt compelled to warn you. My brother was deputy marshal in Santa Fe before a bullet found him last spring. He kept detailed records of notable gunfights throughout the territories." She paused, studying Emmett carefully as he thanked her with a nod and broke bread. "Crane's reputation with a gun isn't just talk. 15 men have tried to stand against him. 3 are buried behind the church, the rest left town broken in spirit if not in body." Emmett's smile held secrets older than his 30-some years. His calloused fingers moved with surprising grace as he served her a portion before taking his own. "The rattlesnake makes much noise with its tail," he said softly, "to distract from its fangs. But the mountain lion hunts in silence." Maria sat down, her shawl falling from her shoulders to reveal a small derringer hidden in a custom holster at her wrist. The gesture was casual but deliberate, letting him know she was no helpless frontier flower. "There are stories," she said carefully, "about a shootout in Bisbee 2 years ago. A cattle baron, drunk and cruel, terrorizing a young Apache family at the station. The next morning they found him alive but humbled, with a bullet hole through. His gun hand so precise it left him whole but unable to ever draw again." Her dark eyes met Emmett's. "My brother was passing through that season, said he witnessed something remarkable. Not just the shooting itself, which happened so fast no one could follow it, but what came after. The shooter never said a word. To his fallen opponent, just knelt beside him, tended his wound to stop the bleeding, then disappeared before the law arrived." Emmett remained motionless, but his right hand unconsciously moved to touch the left side of his chest, where beneath his simple shirt lay a jagged scar, a permanent reminder from his earliest days with a gun, when speed alone wasn't enough, and he'd nearly paid with his life. "The past belongs to yesterday," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Today I am just a man who prefers the company of horses to most people." "Of course," Maria smiled, accepting the steaming cup. Though I must say, the way you handled Crane today reminds me of my father's wisdom. He always said true power speaks softest because it doesn't need to shout to be heard. After Maria's departure, Emmett moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency. The town's night watchman, elderly Samuel Jenkins, had grown accustomed to the blacksmith's nocturnal habits, merely nodding as Emmett checked each corner of the livery, each approach to the building, with the kind of meticulous attention that spoke of a man who understood that small details often separated the living from the dead. In the quiet darkness, Emmett knelt beside his bed and carefully pried up a loose floorboard. From the hidden space, he removed an oilskin-wrapped bundle. His hands moved with reverence as he unfolded the covering to reveal the Remington revolver that had been his constant companion through years he seldom spoke of. The weapon was like him, unadorned, practical, with a history written in wear, patterns and subtle marks that told stories to those who knew how to read them. The gun's previous owner had been a lawman in Colorado, one of the few people who knew Emmett's full story before consumption took him. Marshal David Clark had passed the weapon to Emmett with words that still echoed in his memory. A gun doesn't make a man dangerous, it just makes his mistakes travel faster. Emmett's fingers moved over the weapon with the same gentle precision he showed horses, checking the action, cleaning each part, although it was already immaculate. The ritual was more meditation than maintenance, a way of acknowledging a part of himself he tried to keep buried but knew might be needed before the week was out. 6 days remained until Crane's deadline, and already the pieces were moving on a board far larger than the arrogant rancher could imagine. In his years on the frontier, Emmett had learned more than just gunfighting. He had learned patience, strategy, and the art of letting an opponent's arrogance become their downfall. The following morning brought an unexpected development to Cimarron Creek. A stagecoach arrived from Santa Fe carrying, among its passengers, a distinguished-looking gentleman who moved with the measured grace of someone accustomed to reading dangerous situations. Judge William Haycraft's silver hair and Eastern clothes marked him as out of place in the rough frontier town, but his eyes held the hard awareness of a man well acquainted with frontier justice. He paused at the livery entrance, watching Emmett work with quiet intensity. After several minutes of observation, he spoke in a voice weathered by years of pronouncing both sentences and absolutions. "The way you're holding that hammer, Fort Smith, wasn't it? The winter of '74? Emmett's movement stilled, but he didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed slightly, a tell that only someone looking for it would notice. "I was circuit judge in Arkansas that season," Haycraft continued, stepping into the livery's shadowed interior. 3 of the territory's most feared gunmen were found at dawn, outside the Silver Dollar. Not dead, that's what caught my attention. Each one shot through the right shoulder with surgical precision, clean through the muscle that controls a man's trigger finger. He moved closer, lowering his voice despite the empty stable. They refused to name their attacker, but one of them, delirious with pain, kept mumbling about a man who moved without sound, whose eyes carried a sentence more final than anything a judge could pronounce. Meanwhile, across town, Victor Crane was conducting his own investigations. His inquiries had led him to the telegraph office, where an operator named Maxwell claimed to have information about mysterious messages concerning a gunfighter unlike any other. "The ghost shooter, some called him," Maxwell whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Never leaves them dead. That's what makes him different. Every famous gun in the West, they've got notches on their belts. But this one," his voice dropped further, "he leaves them alive but forever changed, always with a single shot that ensures they'll never harm another soul." Crane scoffed, though his hand tightened around his ornate revolver. "Fairy stories to frighten children. I'm asking about Emmett Reeves." Maxwell's smile held no humor. "Mr. Crane, you don't understand. The stories say he never speaks above a whisper, this ghost gunman. Instead, he lets his revolver do his talking, and its message is always the same. Justice may be silent, but it finds every man who deserves it." Back at the livery, Judge Haycraft had moved closer to Emmett's workspace. "There are those who would pay handsomely to know what really happened in Fort Smith," he mentioned casually. "Those men were feared across 3 territories. Their kind doesn't just lay down their guns without a fight." Emmett finally turned to face him, his grey eyes holding shadows deeper than the stable's corners. "And what of the family they threatened?" he asked softly. "Did those who seek answers care about the widow and children who would have died if not for intervention?" The judge had the grace to look away first. "You've built quite a life here," he observed, changing tactics. "It would be a shame if the past were to resurface." Emmett's expression remained unchanged as he returned to shaping a piece of metal on his anvil. "The past never truly leaves," he replied, each strike of his hammer punctuating his words. "It simply waits, like a loaded chamber in a revolver, for the moment when justice demands its voice be heard." As Haycraft left the stable, he passed Maria Sandoval, carrying a ledger for Thomas Holloway. The young woman had spent her morning fielding increasingly persistent inquiries about the quiet blacksmith. Someone was asking questions in the town's darker corners, offering money for information about Emmett's habits, his past, his capabilities with more than just horseshoes. Cimarron Creek itself seemed to hold its breath as the countdown continued. 5 days remained until Crane's deadline, but as the pieces moved on this elaborate board, it became increasingly unclear who was truly the hunter and who the prey. Every swing of Emmett's hammer, every silent interaction with the town's people, seemed weighted with hidden meaning, like a complex dance where only some of the participants knew the true steps. In his room that evening, Emmett sat at his small table, his movements precise as he field-stripped and reassembled his Remington. The routine was calming, each piece of the weapon telling its own story of justice served. The barrel, worn smooth from countless draws but never carelessly fired. The cylinder, each chamber meticulously maintained. The trigger, set to a pressure that required deliberate intention, never accident. A knock at his door revealed Thomas Holloway, the livery owner's face drawn with concern. "Riders came in from Durango," he said without preamble. "They say Crane sent for help. 3 gunmen, professionals. One of them..." He swallowed hard. "One of them is Isaiah Blackburn." A flicker of recognition crossed Emmett's face at the name. Blackburn's reputation stretched from Texas to Montana, a gunfighter who'd started as a bounty hunter and gradually shifted to whatever work paid, regardless of its nature. Unlike most hired guns, he carried no pretense of honor, just cold, efficiency, and a body count that numbered nearly 40. "They say he's never lost a gunfight," Holloway continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "and he specializes in sending messages for wealthy patrons. Not just killing, but making examples." If Holloway expected fear or concern from his blacksmith, he was disappointed. Emmett's response was characteristically measured. "Every unbeaten man was unbeaten until he met someone better," he said quietly, closing the chamber of his revolver with a soft click before wrapping it again in its oilskin. "A horse trainer learns this early. There's always another stallion over the next hill." The evening brought another visitor, Doc Thompson, still sharp despite his years of patching up the aftermath of frontier violence. He found Emmett at the forge, the glow of hot metal illuminating the blacksmith's concentrated features. "Interesting thing about silence," the old doctor mused, settling his weathered frame into a chair beside the heat. "In my experience, those who don't speak much often have the most to say when it matters." He watched as Emmett shaped a perfect horseshoe with methodical strikes, each blow precisely where it needed to be. "I was in Dodge City 4 years back, saw something peculiar. A gunman who'd built quite a reputation, cruel sort who liked to hurt women and children because they couldn't fight back. Someone called him out one morning just as the sun was rising. Strangest gunfight I ever saw, over before you could blink, and the notorious gunman found himself with a shattered right hand and a lesson in humility he carries to this day. Emmett's hammer strikes never faltered, but his eyes briefly met, the doctor's recognition passing between them. Most interesting part, Doc Thompson continued, wasn't the shooting itself, though that was remarkable. It was what came after. The shooter knelt beside his fallen opponent, stopped the bleeding, made sure the man would live, though never draw against another soul, then disappeared before anyone could ask his name. Outside the livery, life in Cimarron Creek continued, though with a growing undercurrent of tension. Word of Crane's hired guns spread through the town like a prairie fire. Isaiah Blackburn's reputation alone was enough to make most men consider leaving town. But it was his companions who truly worried those who knew frontier history. The gentry, brothers Lucas and Matthew, weren't as famous as Blackburn, but those who knew whispered that they were possibly more dangerous. What they lacked in Blackburn's flamboyance, they made up for in methodical brutality. Unlike most gunfighters who worked alone, the brothers operated as a team, covering each other's vulnerabilities with practiced coordination learned during the war. In the saloon, Crane held court, his confidence restored by the knowledge that 3 of the deadliest guns in the territory were riding to his aid. By week's end, he boasted to a circle of sycophants, Cimarron Creek will remember what happens to those who defy natural order. But in a quiet corner, Judge Haycraft sat with Maria Sandoval, sharing stories that painted a very different picture of natural order. "Your brother would have understood what's happening here," he said softly. "He knew that true justice isn't always found in courtrooms or behind badges. Sometimes it moves quiet as shadow, patient as the moon's passage across the night sky." Maria's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The stories," she whispered. "All those tales of the phantom hand, who appears when innocent people are threatened. They're not just stories, are they?" The judge's smile held secrets. "In my experience, Miss Sandoval, the most important stories are the ones that hide their truth in plain sight, like a gun under a peaceful man's coat." As night fell over Cimarron Creek, Emmett stood at his window watching the stars emerge. The town below had quieted, most citizens retreating behind locked doors earlier than usual. Sensing the gathering storm, on his table lay a small notebook, open to a page filled not with words, but with precise drawings. Diagrams of the town's streets and alleys, notations on distances and angles, the kind of details that only a man intimately familiar with the geometry of violence would consider important. 4 days remained until Crane's deadline, but in the quiet darkness of his room, Emmett's hands moved in a silent ritual, reassembling his Remington with the fluid grace that had made him legendary in circles where such things were discussed in whispers. The metal components clicked together with perfect precision, each piece finding its home without hesitation or error. In those moments, the simple blacksmith seemed to shed his everyday persona, revealing glimpses of the man beneath, the one whose name had once been spoken with a mixture of awe and terror throughout the frontier. Late that night, Maria returned to her father's store, her mind churning with the day's revelations. Through the store's back window, she could see light still burning in Emmett's room above the livery. His shadow moved across the lamplight, and she found herself remembering more of her brother's stories. "There are some men," he had once told her, "who carry their demons so quietly that you'd never know they were there, but corner them, force them to choose between peace and protecting the innocent, and those demons emerge wearing 6 shooters, and dispensing the kind of justice that leaves men breathing but broken." In the telegraph office, Maxwell was finishing his late shift when an urgent message came through from Santa Fe. His hands trembled as he decoded the text, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. The message was brief but chilling. Blackburn party departed noon, stop armed heavily. Stop 3 additional men, joined group stop, known murderers, all stop, caution advised, stop. The news would reach Crane by morning, adding to his growing confidence, but there was a detail Maxwell kept to himself, a second message that had arrived just minutes later from an unknown sender. Tell the quiet one, the sparrow remembers the hawk, a seemingly nonsensical phrase to most. But Maxwell had worked telegraph lines long enough to recognize a coded warning when he saw one. At the Silver Spur, Crane had gathered his closest supporters, planning his strategy for the coming confrontation. Blackburn's reputation alone should be enough, he boasted, pouring another round of bourbon. But with the Gentry brothers backing his play, that blacksmith won't even have time to blink before they put him in the ground. Franklin Pierce, however, noticed something his employer had missed. The livery, he said quietly, cleaning his wire-rimmed spectacles. Have you seen how he's been rearranging things? Moving the water trough, shifting hay bales, repositioning. The hitching posts, clearing lines of sight. What of it? Crane demanded, irritation edging his voice. My brother fought at Shiloh, Pierce explained nervously. Said the most dangerous sharpshooters weren't the ones who made the fanciest shots. They were the ones who spent days preparing their ground, turning every piece of cover, every shadow, every angle to their advantage. Judge Haycraft, overhearing this conversation from his corner table, smiled into his whiskey. He was remembering. Another time, another place. A courthouse in Fort Smith, where 3 notorious gunslingers had tried to free their compatriot. The incident had ended before it truly began, each would-be rescuer found with precisely placed wounds that ended their gunfighting days forever. No one had seen the shooter, but in the aftermath, witnesses spoke of shadows that moved against. The wind and the whisper of a revolver's hammer being cocked in perfect silence. In his room, Emmett continued his methodical preparations, his journal now containing not just diagrams of Cimarron Creek's layout, but detailed observations about Crane's men, their habits, their tendencies, the subtle tells that revealed when they were about to draw. A good gunman, his old mentor had taught him, wins with his mind before his hand ever touches steel. Another page held sketches of Blackburn and the Gentry brothers, drawn from descriptions and reputation. Isaiah Blackburn, they said, favored. Psychological warfare, wearing down his opponents with taunts and threats before the actual confrontation. The Gentrys were different, cold, methodical, with a military precision that made them particularly dangerous in tandem. But Emmett had faced such men before. His fingers traced the worn grip of his Remington, feeling the subtle impressions, where the weapon had molded itself to his hand over the years. Each notch and groove told a story of lessons learned, often painfully, about the geometry of survival. Dawn broke over Cimarron Creek with the color of pale honey, painting the town's weathered buildings in gentle gold that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. The morning stage brought more than just mail and passengers. It carried whispers of what awaited the town. Isaiah Blackburn and the Gentry brothers had made an example of 3 cocky young guns who thought to make their reputation by challenging. The infamous killers outside Yellow Fork. Witnesses described the encounter in horrified whispers, how Blackburn had smiled throughout the entire confrontation, how the Gentrys had moved with military precision, how the whole thing had been over in seconds. Didn't even kill him, the stage driver reported to his rapt audience outside the Iron Horse. Just ruined him. 1 shot apiece, right elbow for the first, gun hand for the second, knee for the third. Said it was just practice for Cimarron Creek. In his forge, Emmett continued his morning routine with methodical precision, but those who knew where to look might have noticed subtle changes. The water trough had been shifted slightly, creating a clear line of fire to the street. New horseshoes hung on the wall in patterns that seemed random, but would provide perfect cover. While appearing entirely innocent, even the anvil had been repositioned to provide both workbench and bulletproof barrier if needed. Maria Sandoval arrived with her usual morning delivery of coffee and bread. But today she carried something else, a worn leather holster that had belonged to her brother. "Found this in his effects," she said quietly, placing it on Emmett's workbench. "Thought you might find it useful." Inside the holster was a piece of folded paper, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Emmett opened it to reveal a crude wanted poster with no image, just a description. The Phantom Hand, $500 reward for information leading to identification. Wanted for questioning in 17 incidents of vigilante justice across the territories. The dates and locations formed a pattern, a trail leading across the frontier like a ghost's footprints. Maria's finger tapped the earliest entry. "My brother was in Tascosa that season," she said softly. "Told me about a drifter who stepped in when a local rancher was terrorizing homesteaders. Said he'd never seen anyone draw so fast it seemed like the gun just appeared in his hand. After that, the rancher could still count his money, but couldn't hold a pistol anymore." Before Emmett could respond, the town's warning bell began to toll. 3 riders had been spotted approaching from the east, their figures black against the rising sun. Judge Haycraft, watching from his hotel window, noted how they rode, Blackburn in the lead, straight-backed and confident, the gentries flanking him like dark angels. They moved with the synchronicity of men who had faced death together many times and expected to do so again. "Showtime!" Crane crowed from his vantage point at the Silver Spurs balcony. But Franklin Pierce, ever observant, noticed something. His employer had missed. The street was emptying, yes, but not in panic. People were moving with purpose, taking positions that seemed almost choreographed. The elderly Chinese laundryman, usually stooped and humble, now stood straight-backed. In his doorway, a shotgun-shaped bundle wrapped in canvas propped beside him. The Mexican farrier, who everyone dismissed as simple muscle, had positioned himself on the blacksmith's roof, a rifle-sized package near his hand. Even Sarah, the young girl who swept the boarding house steps, seemed to be following some unspoken script as she gathered her broom and moved to a very specific spot in a nearby alley. Blackburn swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his spurs chiming softly against the packed earth. His black duster hung open, revealing twin revolvers worn butts forward for the cross-draw he'd made famous. The Gentry brothers dismounted in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. "Interesting," Blackburn mused, studying the livery's entrance. "Very interesting indeed." "What is?" Crane demanded, approaching with Franklin Pierce trailing anxiously behind. Blackburn ignored him, his attention fixed on subtle details most would miss. "You see it too, don't you, boys?" he asked the Gentrys, who nodded in perfect synchrony. "How the water trough creates a natural barrier," began Lucas Gentry. "How those hay bales would provide perfect cover," continued Matthew. "How every approach to that forge forces us to expose ourselves," they finished together. Crane's face darkened with confusion and growing anger. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Blackburn replied, his gentle voice taking on an edge sharper than the razors he kept in his boot tops, "that your blacksmith isn't just some drifter who needs to learn his place. This," he gestured at the carefully arranged scene before them, "this is the work of someone who knows exactly what he's doing." In the forge, Emmett continued working at his anvil, but his movements had taken on a different quality. The same fluid efficiency, but now with an underlying tension, like a coiled spring. His right hand remained conspicuously clean, despite the grime of his work, wiped methodically after each hammer strike. Maria Sandoval had positioned herself in her father's store, a Winchester rifle hidden beneath the counter. She remembered her brother's words about real gunfights. Half the battle is fought before the first shot. It's about position, about preparation, about knowing exactly where every friend and foe will be when the thunder rolls. Blackburn took a few steps into the street, his black-gloved hands nowhere near his guns. "You've got it wrong, Crane," he said, loud enough to carry to the watching town. "The question isn't whether your blacksmith will learn his place. The question is whether you've just dragged us all into someone else's carefully planned endgame." The Gentry brothers exchanged glances, their usual confidence showing the first hints of uncertainty. They had survived this long by reading situations accurately, by sensing traps before they could spring shut. And everything about this situation felt like a trap, one that had been laid with the patience of a spider and the precision of a surgeon. Crane's face contorted with rage. "You're paid to handle problems, not philosophize." Blackburn's laugh was soft and deadly as a rattlesnake's warning. "Oh, but that's exactly what I'm doing. You see, I've heard stories about a man who never raises his voice, who appears in troubled towns and dispenses a very particular kind of justice. They say he never kills, just leaves his opponents with very specific injuries, the kind that ensure they'll never harm another soul." In the forge, Emmett had set down his hammer, his head slightly cocked, listening to Blackburn's words carrying clearly in the morning air. "They call him different names in different places," Blackburn continued, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "The ghost hand, the whisper shot, the phantom. But all the stories share one detail. He's always exactly where he needs to be, exactly when he needs to be there, with everything arranged just so." He gestured at the street around them. "Kind of like this." Crane's face had turned an ugly shade of purple. "Are you saying you're afraid of some blacksmith?" "Afraid?" Blackburn's smile was terrible in its gentleness. "No, I'm intrigued. You. See, 3 years ago in Arizona, I witnessed his handiwork. 3 of the meanest guns in the territory, each one shot through the joint in exactly the same place, with exactly the same precision. The kind of shooting that isn't just skill, it's art." The Gentry brothers had begun to move, trying to find positions that wouldn't leave them exposed. But everywhere they looked, they found angles covered, approaches blocked, potential cover, already occupied by seemingly innocent townspeople who might not be so innocent after all. "So here's what I think," Blackburn said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly very attentive street. "I think you've done something very foolish, Mr. Crane. I think you've mistaken quietness for weakness, patience for fear, and preparation for coincidence. And I think you've hired us to walk into a trap that's been days, maybe weeks, in the making." Doc Thompson, watching from his surgery window, felt an old familiar tension in the air, the same feeling he'd known before great battles, when the first shots were yet to be fired, but the killing ground was already chosen. He noticed how Emmett had positioned himself perfectly in relation to every possible angle of attack, how his seemingly casual stance left his right hand free and clean. "More than that," Blackburn continued, his musical voice taking on a note of professional admiration, "I think I know exactly who your blacksmith is. There's only one man in all the territories who works like this, who turns an entire town into a weapon without a single soul realizing it until it's too late." Crane spat into the dust. "You talk too much, Blackburn. Either do what I'm paying you for or what?" Blackburn's gentle voice cut through Crane's bluster like a razor. "You'll find someone else? Someone who doesn't recognize the signature of the man who single-handedly disarmed the Watson gang in Colorado? Who doesn't know the stories of the phantom hand who humbled the Donovan brothers in Kansas?" In the forge doorway, Emmett's right, hand moved in a simple gesture. To most it would have looked like nothing, a working man stretching tired muscles. But Judge Haycraft saw the truth of it, a signal, a message to those who knew how to read such things. Get ready. Cimarron Creek held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. In that moment of tension, time seemed to stretch like molasses, each second pregnant with possibility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, shadows that seemed to point like accusing fingers at the men who had come looking for easy violence and found instead a carefully laid trap. "Last chance, Crane," Blackburn said softly. "Walk away, leave the blacksmith be, find easier prey." But Crane, his face purple with rage and wounded pride, had passed the point of reason. "Shoot him!" he screamed. "Shoot them all!" The words had barely left his mouth when several things happened at once. The Gentry brothers moved with their famous coordination, splitting apart to seek better positions. Blackburn's hand dropped to his gun with practiced grace, and in the forge doorway, Emmett shifted his weight ever so slightly, a movement so subtle it would have been missed by anyone not trained to watch for such things. Maria's hands tightened on the Winchester beneath the counter. Judge Haycraft straightened in his chair, his weathered hand resting near an old army Colt. Throughout Cimarron Creek, seemingly innocent townspeople made their own subtle preparations, each one a piece in Emmett's carefully arranged chess game. "Hold!" Blackburn called, his gentle voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The Gentrys froze, their instincts for survival overriding Crane's commands. "You feel it too, don't you, boys? The wrongness of it all?" The identical gunman nodded, the cold eyes scanning the street with new understanding. Where before they had seen only random townspeople and ordinary objects, now they recognized the careful positioning of it all. How every innocent-looking obstacle could become cover. How every townsperson stood exactly where they needed to be to control the street's killing zones. 2 years ago, Blackburn continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a man telling a story around a campfire, "I heard about a gunfight in Colorado. A gang of raiders had taken over a small town, thinking they could terrorize the locals into submission. They found themselves facing a single man, a quiet drifter who'd been working as a blacksmith." Crane's hand twitched toward his gun, but Blackburn's next words froze him in place. Not one of those raiders died that day, but every single one of them left that town with their gun hands ruined, each wound placed with surgical precision. The interesting part: witnesses said the whole thing was over in less than 30 seconds, and the quiet man never seemed to move from the forge doorway where he'd been standing. In the growing tension, Doc Thompson remembered something from his army days. How the best ambush positions were the ones that looked completely natural until the moment the trap was sprung. Looking around Cimarron Creek now, he saw the same. Principles at work. Every water trough, every hitching post, every stack of supplies had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire while appearing entirely innocent. The locals called him the Phantom Hand. Blackburn went on, his voice almost dreamy, said he had a way of appearing in troubled towns, setting things right, then vanishing like morning mist. Never spoke above a whisper, never killed a soul, but left his mark in a way that couldn't be ignored. Emmett remained motionless in the forge doorway, but his presence seemed to grow larger, filling the space with unspoken tension. His right hand hung loosely at his side, fingers slightly curled, ready. You want to know the really interesting part? Blackburn's gentle voice took on an edge of professional admiration. Every time, the setup was the same. The whole town turned into a trap, with everyday folk positioned just so, and the troublemakers never realizing until it was too late that they were standing exactly where he wanted them. The Gentry brothers exchanged another glance, their identical faces showing the first real traces of concern anyone had ever seen on them. They had built their reputation on being able to control any situation through perfect coordination, but now they found themselves in a scenario where every possible move seemed to play into someone else's plan. Crane, however, remained oblivious to the deeper currents moving beneath the surface. "Enough ghost stories," he snarled. "I didn't hire you three to swap tales like old women at a quilting bee. Either you deal with this problem or what?" Blackburn interrupted, his soft voice somehow more threatening than any shout. "You'll find someone else? Someone who doesn't recognize the work of the man who single-handedly disarmed the entire Fletcher gang without taking a single step? Who hasn't heard the whispers about a gunman so fast his opponent swore the bullet found? Then before they heard the shot, the morning sun had climbed higher, shortening the shadows but intensifying the heat that seemed to shimmer in waves off the packed earth of Cimarron Creek's main street. Every window, every doorway, every alley mouth seemed to hold watching eyes, though few people were visible. The town itself had become a character in this unfolding drama, its very architecture now part of an elaborate trap, years in the making. "Last chance," Blackburn said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Walk away, Crane. Find easier prey. Because I'm starting to think we're not the hunters here at all." In the general store, Maria's finger curled around the Winchesters. Trigger. Remembering her brother's lessons about patience and timing. Judge Haycraft's hand stayed near his Colt, his eyes tracking the subtle shifts in position as everyone on the street tried to find their place in this deadly dance. Crane's answer came in the form of a wild shot fired at the forge doorway, the bullet kicking up splinters from the wooden frame. The sound echoed off Cimarron Creek's buildings like the first thunderclap of an approaching storm, and in its wake, the carefully arranged pieces of Emmett's trap began to move. The moment Crane's bullet struck the doorframe, Cimarron Creek exploded into carefully orchestrated chaos. The Gentry brothers moved like mirror images, diving for cover that suddenly seemed inadequate. Blackburn dropped and rolled with fluid grace, his gun appearing in his hand as if by magic, but Emmett hadn't moved at all. He stood in exactly the same position, as if the bullet hadn't passed within inches of his head. Only his eyes had changed, taking on the flat, deadly focus that old-timers claimed could freeze a rattlesnake in mid-strike. "Hold your fire, you fool!" Blackburn's musical voice carried an edge of real anger now. "Can't you see he's—" But Crane, caught in the grip of wounded pride and blind rage, fired again and again, each shot kicking up splinters around the forge doorway. Yet Emmett remained unmoved, like a statue carved from the very wood he stood before. Then his right hand began to move. To most observers, the gesture might have appeared random, perhaps the nervous fidgeting of a man under fire. But Judge Haycraft, watching intently from his window, recognized it for what it was, a signal, each motion precise and purposeful. All across Cimarron Creek, seemingly ordinary citizens responded. The Chinese laundryman's bundle came unwrapped, revealing a carefully maintained greener shotgun. The Mexican farrier shifted position on the roof, a Winchester rifle glinting in the morning sun. Even young Sarah produced a small derringer from her apron pocket with practiced ease. "Sweet Jesus," Matthew Gentry breathed, the first words anyone had heard him speak independently. "The whole damn town is his weapon," Lucas finished, equally stunned. "Has been from the moment he arrived," Blackburn added, a note of professional admiration in his gentle voice. Every person, every position, every angle, all part of his plan. Crane, finally sensing the trap he'd walked into, turned his gun toward Blackburn. "I'm paying you to—" The rest of his words were lost in the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The gun flew from Crane's hand, accompanied by a spray of blood from his knuckles. He howled in pain and outrage, but the sound was cut short by the realization that the shot had come from behind him. Franklin Pierce stood there, rifle still smoking, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting in the morning sun. "I tried to warn you, Victor," he called down. "Tried to make you see what was really happening here. Some of us have known for weeks who our quiet blacksmith really was. The Gentry brothers, reading the shifting tide with the instinct that had kept them alive through countless gunfights, began to edge away from their positions. But everywhere they turned, they found their movements anticipated, covered by townspeople who suddenly looked far more dangerous than their everyday appearances. Suggested Blackburn alone seemed untroubled by this turn of events. If anything, his gentle smile had grown wider. "You know what fascinates me most?" he mused, his gun held loosely but ready. Not the trap itself, though it's beautifully laid, I must admit. No, what fascinates me is the patience, the willingness to spend weeks, maybe months, setting everything in place, turning an entire town into a weapon, piece by piece, person by person. In the forged doorway, Emmett's right hand moved again. This time Maria translated from her position in the store. He says there's still time to walk away. No one needs to be hurt today. Crane, clutching his bleeding hand, snarled defiance. Do you think this changes anything? My father owns half the territory. One telegram and what? Judge Haycraft's voice cut through the morning air as he emerged from his hotel. More men will come to be met by more townspeople who've learned to stand against tyranny. How many hired guns can you afford to lose, Mr. Crane? The judge's words carried weight, but it was the paper he held that caught Crane's attention, a telegram from the territorial governor himself. You see, Haycraft continued, some of us have been gathering evidence. Bank records, witness statements, documentation of your family's more creative business practices, all waiting to be released unless certain changes are made in how the Crane Empire operates in this territory. Blackburn's musical laugh carried across the street. Oh, this is even better than I'd heard. Not just a trap for today, but a complete dismantling of the corrupt system. Tell me, he addressed Emmett directly, how long have you been planning this? How many towns like Cimarron Creek have you transformed from victims into vectors of justice? Emmett's only response was to shift his weight slightly, his right hand still nowhere near his concealed Remington, but somehow more threatening for that very reason. Those who knew what to look for could read volumes in that simple movement, the perfect balance, the contained energy, the absolute certainty of someone who had choreographed every moment of this confrontation long before it began. The gentry. Brothers had reached their own decision. With synchronized movement that had made them famous, they slowly unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall to the dust. Smart boys, Blackburn commented, his gentle voice carrying clear approval. They don't teach that kind of wisdom in most gunfighting circles, knowing when you're outmaneuvered, outplanned, and completely out of options. Crane stared at his hired guns in disbelief. Cowards, all of you, His words cut off as Emmett finally moved. The motion was so smooth, so perfectly executed, that many observers would later swear they hadn't seen him draw at all. One moment his hand was empty, the next his Remington seemed to materialize, already aimed with deadly precision at the space between Crane's eyes. But Crane never saw the gun. His attention was captured entirely by Emmett's eyes, eyes that held not anger or hatred, but something far more terrifying, absolute certainty. In them, Crane saw the truth that Blackburn had been trying to tell him, that he hadn't hired guns to deal with a troublesome blacksmith. He had unknowingly challenged a force of nature, a living embodiment of frontier justice, who had spent weeks preparing for this very moment. Remarkable, Blackburn breathed, studying the tableau before him with a professional's eye. The gun's not even the real weapon, is it? This whole town, every person, every position, it's all one giant trap, and we walked right into it exactly as you planned. Maria, watching from her position in the store, remembered her brother's words about true gunfighters, how the best ones won their battles long before the first shot was fired, through preparation, position, and the ability to read both people and situations with perfect clarity. In the growing heat of the morning, Cimarron Creek held its breath, the moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and peace hanging in perfect equilibrium. Every person on the street knew their role in what might come next, roles that had been carefully assigned and rehearsed through weeks of subtle preparation. Yet it was Crane himself who finally broke the tension, though not in any way anyone expected. Looking into Emmett's unwavering eyes, something seemed to crack inside him. The arrogance, the blind rage, the certainty of his own power, all of it fell away, leaving behind something smaller and more human. "Who?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Who are you really?" Emmett's free hand moved in a series of subtle gestures that Judge Haycraft translated. He says, "He's what you and your kind created, justice that learned to move in silence, mercy that learned to speak through steel, the consequence of thinking that money and power put you above the law." Blackburn's gentle laugh carried a note of genuine delight. "Oh, that's perfect, absolutely perfect. You know, I came here today expecting to add to my reputation. Instead, I find myself in the middle of a legend in the making. The phantom hand who turns entire towns into weapons of justice." The Gentry brothers had begun to back away, their matching faces showing something rarely seen, respect tinged with fear. They'd built their reputation on being able to read situations, to anticipate their opponent's moves. But this was like trying to outmaneuver a flash flood or predict where lightning would strike. "You know what this reminds me of?" Blackburn continued, his musical voice carrying across the street. "A tale I heard down in Texas about a village that had been terrorized by rustlers. Story goes, a stranger rode in one day, never spoke above a whisper, just started working as a blacksmith. Week by week, month by month, things in that village started to change. People standing straighter, learning new skills, finding their courage." Crane's face had gone pale, the blood from his injured hand staining the dust at his feet. "This is impossible. You're just one man." "That's where you're wrong," Judge Haycraft interjected. "Look around you, Mr. Crane. Really look. Every person you see has been touched by his example, taught by his patience, and shown that there's a different way to face tyranny." And it was true. Looking around Cimarron Creek now, Crane could see how everything had changed during the weeks. Since Emmett's arrival, the Chinese laundryman no longer stooped or shuffled. He stood straight, his shotgun held with the confidence of long practice. The Mexican farrier's position on the roof showed evidence of careful training in choosing firing positions. Even young Sarah held her derringer with the steady hands of someone who had been carefully taught. Emmett's Remington hadn't wavered, but something in his stance shifted subtly. Those who knew how to read such things, Blackburn, the Gentrys, Judge Haycraft, recognized the change. The trap was complete, the lesson delivered, and now came the moment of choice. As Emmett slowly lowered his Remington, the movement was as smooth and deliberate as its drawing had been. The gesture spoke volumes in the language of the frontier, not weakness or surrender, but the extension of mercy that only the truly powerful could afford to give. "Every man stands at a crossroads at some point," Blackburn observed, holstering his own weapon with elegant precision, his gentle smile never wavering. "One path leads to more violence, more pain, more reason for good people to learn the ways of the gun. The other—" Crane looked up, meeting Emmett's steady gaze. The fear that had gripped him moments before began to give way to comprehension, perhaps even the first stirrings of respect. "The other path is the harder one, Mr. Crane," Judge Haycraft provided, folding the governor's telegram carefully. "It's the path of change, of making amends, of turning power into protection instead of tyranny. I've seen men take both paths. In my time, the smart ones, the ones who live to see old age, they usually choose the second." In the forged doorway, Emmett finally broke his silence. His voice, when it came, was as quiet as ever, but carried clearly across the hushed street. "The choice is yours," he said simply. "But choose wisely, because while I may someday leave Cimarron Creek, what I've built here will remain. This town will never be defenseless again." Blackburn nodded appreciatively, his eyes taking in the transformed town with newfound understanding. "I'd wager there's not a settlement in 3 territories that could stand against this place now, not with every citizen a defender, every corner covered, every approach watched." He chuckled softly. "And all without a badge or a marshal in sight." Judge Haycraft stepped forward, the telegram from the territorial governor still in his hand. Your father has already chosen his path, Mr. Crane. He's agreed to a full audit of his business practices, fair wages for his workers, and a complete restructuring of how the Crane Empire operates in this territory. He handed the paper to Crane, who took it with his uninjured hand. The only question now is whether you'll be part of that change or an obstacle to it. The silence that followed seemed to contain all the tension of the past weeks, all the careful preparation and patient teaching that had transformed Cimarron Creek from just another frontier town into something else entirely. A symbol of what could happen when good people learn to stand together against tyranny. Crane looked around one final time, seeing his situation with new clarity. Every window, every doorway, every position of apparent advantage had been carefully prepared to neutralize him and his hired guns. More than that, every person he had dismissed as weak or unimportant had been transformed into a defender of their town. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a strange kind of acceptance, and perhaps there was even something like relief in his voice when he finally spoke. "I choose the second path," he said quietly. "God help me, I choose to change." Blackburn holstered his gun with elegant precision, his gentle smile never wavering. "Now that," he said softly, "is the kind of wisdom that lets a man grow old in the territories." He turned to address Emmett directly. "I don't suppose you're looking for partners in this enterprise of yours. The idea of teaching towns to protect themselves has a certain appeal to a man who's seen too many good people fall to bad men's ambitions." The question hung in the air as Emmett carefully secured his Remington in its holster beneath his blacksmith's apron. His response, when it came, carried both caution and possibility. "Justice isn't a business venture," he said quietly. "It's a calling that each must find in their own way." The Gentry brothers exchanged one of their identical looks, the kind that had preceded so many coordinated attacks. But this time, Lucas spoke not of violence but of transformation. "What about us?" he asked, gesturing at himself and his brother. "We've built our reputation on being guns for hire, but this—" He indicated the town and its transformed inhabitants. "This is something else entirely." Judge Haycraft stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "Cimarron Creek could use men with your skills, not as hired guns, but as teachers. There are other towns in the territory that need to learn what we've learned here. The twins considered this, their synchronized movements making the moment almost ceremonial. Teaching instead of threatening," Matthew mused. "Being part of the solution instead of the problem," Lucas added. "It has a certain appeal," they finished together. Throughout Cimarron Creek, the carefully positioned townspeople began to emerge from their stations. The Chinese laundryman Feng Wei propped his greener shotgun against a wall and straightened his simple clothes with dignity. The Mexican farrier Miguel Vega descended from his rooftop perch with the fluid grace of a man who had found new purpose in life. Doc Thompson watched it all with a physician's eye for detail. "You know what's truly remarkable," he commented to no one in particular. "Not just the physical training, but the psychological transformation. These people haven't just learned to handle weapons. They've learned to stand tall, to believe in themselves." Sarah, the young girl with the derringer, approached Emmett with newfound confidence. "Will you stay?" she asked, voicing the question that seemed to hang in the air. Now that the confrontation had ended, now that it's done, will you stay and teach us more? Emmett's response was measured, his words as carefully chosen as always. "There are other towns that need what Cimarron Creek has learned," he said softly. "Other people who need to discover their own strength." Crane, still nursing his injured hand, looked around at the town he had tried to dominate, seeing it with new eyes. "I never understood," he said quietly. "All this time, I thought power came from making people fear you. But this is real. A power, isn't it? People standing together, protecting each other." Blackburn's musical laugh carried genuine appreciation. Now you're beginning to understand, though I suspect our quiet friend here could teach us all a few more lessons about the nature of true power. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last shadows from Cimarron Creek's streets. In that clear light, everyone could see how the town had been transformed, not just physically, with its carefully arranged defenses, but spiritually. People stood straighter, looked each other in the eye, carried themselves with the quiet dignity of those who had found their own strength. Emmett moved away from the forged doorway for the first time since the confrontation began. His steps were measured, purposeful, each movement an economy of grace that spoke of years of discipline. He stopped before Crane and extended his hand. Not his right, his gun hand, but his left, blackened with the honest work of the forge. True. Change begins when we realize that every person has value, he said quietly. Every voice matters, even those that speak softly. Remember this day, Mr. Crane. Remember how it feels to choose a better path. The Gentry brothers had begun collecting the dropped weapons, handling them with the respect of men who understood both their danger and their necessity. What happens now? Lucas asked, looking to Judge Haycraft. The judge held up the telegram from the territorial governor. Now we begin the real work. The Crane Empire will be restructured, its power redirected toward building up communities rather than controlling them. And Cimarron Creek will serve as an example of what's possible when people learn to stand together against tyranny. Blackburn, watching Emmett's fluid movements, smiled his gentle smile. And our quiet friend here, he'll move on, I suspect, find another town that needs what he teaches, another place where justice needs to learn how to speak without raising its voice. In the general store, Maria Sandoval looked at the Winchester rifle she had held with such purpose. Understanding, now that it was more than just a weapon, it was a symbol of the change Emmett had brought to Cimarron Creek. Will others come? She asked. Men like Crane thinking to take advantage once you're gone. Emmett's response carried both warning and promise. They might, but they'll find more than they bargained for, because what I leave behind isn't just trained defenders. It's a community that has learned its own worth, its own strength, and that's something no amount of money or hired guns can defeat. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through Cimarron Creek like wind across prairie. Grass, word spread fast in frontier towns, but this was different. This wasn't just another tale of gunfight glory or quick-draw prowess. This was a story about transformation, about how a silent stranger had turned an entire community from victims into guardians of their own destiny. In the days that followed, Crane's father arrived from Denver, his usual bombastic manner subdued by the reality of what had transpired. Harold Crane was a man accustomed to solving problems with money or threats, but he found himself facing something entirely new, a united community that could neither be bought nor bullied. Remarkable, the elder Crane mused, watching from the Silver Spur's balcony as Emmett worked with a group of townspeople below. He's not just teaching them to handle weapons, he's teaching them to think differently about power itself. Judge Haycraft, sharing a morning coffee with the cattle baron, nodded thoughtfully. That's what makes him truly dangerous to men. Like you used to be, Harold. Not his skill with a gun, though that's considerable, but his ability to show people their own strength. Below, Emmett's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he demonstrated proper stance and positioning to a mixed group that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Chinese laundrymen stood alongside Mexican laborers and shopkeepers' wives, all learning the subtle art of defending what was theirs. Blackburn had chosen to stay, at least for a while. His gentle voice added verbal instruction to Emmett's quiet demonstrations. Balance, he would say, walking among the students. Everything begins with balance. In your stance, in your mind, in your community. Our friend here understood that Long before any of us, the Gentry brothers had found their own niche in Cimarron Creek's transformation. Their mirror image movements, once used to terrorize, now served to demonstrate the importance of coordination and teamwork in defense. They worked primarily with family groups, showing parents and children how to protect each other. "Never thought I'd see the day," Doc Thompson commented, watching the twins guide a shopkeeper's family through defensive positions. Those two were infamous for tearing families apart. Now here they are, helping to make them stronger. Maria Sandoval had taken on the role of primary interpreter for Emmett's increasingly complex lessons. She noticed how his teachings went far beyond mere physical defense. His quiet words and subtle gestures spoke of strategy, of community organization, of the importance of everyone playing their part in the larger whole. "It's like a dance," she explained to a group of newcomers. "Each person has their steps, their position, their moment to move. Together, we create something stronger than any one person could be alone." One morning, about a week after the confrontation, Franklin Pierce found Emmett making adjustments to the forge's layout. The former ally of Crane watched in fascination as the quiet blacksmith transformed simple architectural features into subtle defensive positions. "You know," Pierce mused, cleaning his wire-rimmed spectacles, "I've been studying your methods. The way you layer your preparations, physical, psychological, social, it's not just about defense, is it? It's about changing how people see themselves." Emmett nodded, his response characteristically measured. "True strength isn't in the gun or the hand that holds it," he said quietly. "It's in the heart that knows when to act and the mind that knows how to prepare." The transformation of Cimarron Creek attracted attention from other communities in the territory. Visitors would arrive, ostensibly for trade or business, but their real purpose was to observe how one town had managed to break free from the cycle of violence and exploitation that plagued so many frontier settlements. Judge Haycraft found himself acting as an unofficial ambassador, explaining to these visitors the deeper principles behind Cimarron Creek's change. "It's not just about learning to shoot straight," he would say. "It's about learning to stand straight, to look a man in the eye and know your own worth." Harold Crane, watching his empire transform under the new arrangements, discovered something unexpected. Profits actually increased when workers were treated fairly and communities were allowed to thrive. "All those years," he confided to Blackburn one evening, "I thought fear was the only way to maintain control. Never realized that willing cooperation could be more profitable than forced submission." The changes weren't just economic or social. Cimarron Creek itself seemed to wear a different aspect now. The streets felt more open, more welcoming, yet somehow more secure. Every citizen moved with new purpose, new dignity, as if they had discovered something precious within themselves. Feng Wei, the Chinese laundryman, expressed it best in his careful English. "Before we hide, bend low, stay quiet, hope trouble passes by. Now we stand tall, not because we want to fight, but because we know how to prevent fights." Very different thing. Sarah, the young girl who had played her part in the confrontation, had become something of a symbol for Cimarron Creek's youth. She organized the children into messenger networks, teaching them to be alert and observant without being fearful. "Mr. Reeves showed us that being strong doesn't always mean being loud," she would say. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should watch most carefully." But not everyone celebrated Cimarron Creek's transformation. In saloons and gambling halls across the territory, certain men spoke with growing concern about this new approach to frontier justice. The very idea of communities learning to defend themselves threatened many who had built their power on others' vulnerability. "Mark my words," a notorious gunman was heard to say in Durango, "this will spread if we don't stop it. Next thing you know, every two-bit town in the territory will be getting ideas about standing up for themselves." These rumblings reached Cimarron. Greek through the telegraph office, where Maxwell had learned to pay careful attention to certain types of messages. "Threats coming in from all over," he reported to Judge Haycraft. "Seems our quiet friend has stirred up quite a hornet's nest." Emmett received this news with his usual calm, but those who knew him well noticed subtle changes in his preparations. His lessons became more intensive, focusing increasingly on how the town could defend itself without his presence. His quiet instructions carried greater urgency, as if racing against time. "He knows," Blackburn observed to Maria one evening as they watched Emmett drill a group in coordination tactics. "What's happened here has started something bigger than this town, bigger than any of us. The old powers won't surrender their grip easily." The Gentry brothers, with their practiced eye for danger, had begun teaching townspeople about watching for certain types of strangers. Men who asked too many questions, who studied defensive positions too carefully, who carried themselves with the particular tension of those planning violence. "The real test," Lucas commented to his brother, "will come when he leaves, when Cimarron Creek has to stand on its own against whatever's coming." Victor Crane, his hand healing but his shooting days clearly behind him, had found a new role in the community. His knowledge of the territory's criminal elements proved invaluable in helping prepare for future threats. "Funny thing," he mused one day, watching Emmett work with a new group of students. "All my life I thought power meant making people fear. You never understood that real power is helping people overcome their fears." As summer began to fade toward autumn, subtle signs suggested that Emmett's work in Cimarron Creek was nearing its completion. His lessons became more focused on leadership and organization, teaching key community members how to train others in the techniques he had shared. Maria noticed it first, the way he would step back during training sessions, letting others take the lead while he observed and guided with minimal intervention. "You're preparing us for when you're gone," she said one evening. It wasn't a question. Emmett's response was simple, but carried depths of meaning. Every teacher's greatest success is seeing students become teachers themselves. Judge Haycraft, watching a training session from his usual spot on the hotel porch, shared his observations with Blackburn. Notice how he structured everything in layers: the outer ring of scouts and lookouts, the inner defensive positions, the communication networks. But more than that, the way he's woven it all into the town's daily life. Blackburn nodded, his gentle voice thoughtful. "Like a spider's web, but made of people and purpose instead of silk. Every strand connected, every connection strengthening. The whole." He paused, watching Emmett correct a young man's stance with silent efficiency. "You know what's coming, don't you?" "Other towns have already sent requests," the judge confirmed. "Desperate messages from communities facing their own versions of what Cimarron Creek once faced. They've heard the stories. They want what we've found here." In the telegraph office, Maxwell had begun training his young apprentice not just in Morse code, but in reading between the lines of certain messages. "See here," he would explain, pointing to seemingly innocent communications. "When they mention weather conditions, they're really asking about how many gunmen are in town. Market prices often mean bribes or protection money. Mr. Reeves taught me to read the shadows in words, just like he taught us to watch the shadows in the street." The first snow of winter dusted Cimarron Creek's rooftops with white. But the town's warmth came from more than just its well-tended fires. In the months since the confrontation with Crane, something remarkable had taken root and flourished, a sense of purpose that transformed everyday activities into expressions of community strength. One cold morning, Blackburn found Emmett adding final entries to his journal. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound in the forge's early quiet. "You know what's happening out there, don't you?" the gentle-voiced gunman asked, warming his hands around a cup of coffee. "It's spreading. Every rider that leaves here carries more than just memories. They carry ideas." Emmett's response was characteristically measured. "Ideas are like seeds. They only need good soil and time to grow. The truth of this was becoming evident throughout the territory. Reports arrived daily of other communities beginning to stand against oppression. Some attempts failed, others succeeded, but the pattern was clear. Cimarron Creek had become more than just a town. It had become a symbol of what was possible. The morning everyone had been both anticipating and dreading finally arrived, with the first hints of spring thaw. Emmett's preparations for departure were characteristically subtle. A few small adjustments to his saddle, a final review of his journal's entries, quiet moments spent observing the town's daily rhythms from his usual spot in the forge doorway. He mounted his horse, the movement carrying the same fluid grace that had once marked him as a deadly gunfighter. Cimarron Creek demonstrated one final time how well they had learned his lessons. Without a word being spoken, the entire community shifted into defensive positions, maintaining security even in their moment of emotional farewell. "Look at that," Blackburn murmured admiringly. Not a command given, not a word spoken, but everyone knows exactly where they need to be, exactly what they need to do. That's not just training, that's transformation. As Emmett turned his horse toward the distant horizon, Sarah's messenger network began a game that spread like a wave through the streets. To ordinary observers, it might have looked like simple play, but those who understood saw it for what it was. A promise to keep the lessons alive, to continue building on what they had learned. Judge Haycraft, watching the silent teacher ride away, spoke words that would be remembered and repeated across the frontier. Some men changed things with guns and violence, others with money and influence. But he changed things with silence and wisdom, showing us that the strongest voice is the one that speaks through the actions of an entire community. The legend of the Phantom Hand grew not as a tale of deadly skill with a weapon, but as a story of transformation, of how one man's quiet wisdom helped communities across the frontier find their own strength, their own voice, their own way of standing against oppression. And somewhere out on the frontier, they say a quiet blacksmith still appears in troubled towns, still teaches communities to stand together, still plants seeds of resistance and unity that grow into something stronger than any weapon, the power of people standing as one. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen.